Dear learners, this audiovisual lecture will be on George Eliot's novel Middlemarch, which is part of your PG Part 1 Paper 4 syllabus. Now you are all aware that Middlemarch is a multi-plot novel with a multiplicity of themes and a web of characters. Now the themes of the novel are marriage, vocation, education of sympathy and reform. However, in the scope of today's lecture, it will be possible only to talk about one of the central themes, that is the theme of vocation. I will try to point out how vocation is treated as an indispensable human need irrespective of gender and irrespective of Victorian gender stereotyping by George Eliot. Now you are all aware that Victorian society denied to its women the fulfillment which comes from choosing a satisfying vocation. It restricted them to the most mundane and limited options related to education, which would only push them towards their destined roles and their destined vocations of marriage and motherhood. George Eliot was perhaps the first English novelist to bring vocation as a serious, sustaining, fulfilling business of life to the forefront of the narrative ever since the emergence of the novel form in English. In all her novels, we see the theme of vocation as a central element, be it novels such as Adam Bede, where we see Dina Morris, who is a philanthropist who tries to help everybody in the society around her, be it a novel like Felix Holt the Radical, where we see Mrs. Transome, who is in charge of her entire estate, even in the presence of her husband, who however is decrepit and redundant in his role of taking care of the estate. Even in novels like Mill and the Floss, Romola, Daniel Deronda, everywhere vocation is a central theme in her novels. However, when we come to a novel like Middlemarch, it is a novel where she centralizes the theme of vocation, brings it from the peripheries to the center, showing that it is necessary for man, woman, irrespective of gender, to have a satisfying vocation. And it is because of this, especially highlighting the needs of women to search for a vocation to have a fulfilled life, that Eliot has perhaps often been branded as a feminist or even a political activist. Middlemarch can be read as a text which treats vocation as the means of anchorage, fulfillment and self-identity for every individual. Now the prelude to Middlemarch is very interesting, as it seems to suggest that the novel is going to talk about vocation on an epic or a heroic scale. However, when we are acquainted with the initial chapters or the entire narrative as such, every expectation that the prelude builds up is thwarted. It implies, it is an indirect commentary on the domestic milieu and the circumstances of Victorian England, that for women at least, it is impossible to have a satisfying vocation apart from that of being a wife or a mother. And it is not possible for Dorothy Brooke to be a later day Teresa. This allusion to Saint Teresa goes some way to criticize the limitations of the restrictive lives of Victorian women and Victorian Teresas. And I would like to read out this very important section from the prelude, where Eliot is trying to exactly satirize this point. I quote, "Many Teresas have been born who found for themselves no epic life wherein there was a constant unfolding of far resonant action. However, despite such a deflation, vocation is still one of Middlemarch's main themes, seeing it as apparent in both Dorothy and Tercius Lydgate, who are both the central characters, placing importance thereby on the yearning that an individual has for a satisfying vocation rather than on its achievement. These characters, meaning Lydgate and Dorothy, are preoccupied with finding a vocation which is fulfilling, and yet it is this search, this aspiration, which originates in much conflict within the novel. Middlemarch may be regarded as the finest example of the Victorianism, as it were, of the Victorian novel. That is to say, In its panorama of society, we see man interacting and functioning in his conventions or institutions of church, landholding and inheritance, marriage, medicine, scholarship, politics and labor. The different characters in their different vocations and lifestyles are shown as intersecting at every point of life. In the novels of Eliot, exploration of emotions and morals is most important, but what makes her singular in the treatment of vocation is the fact that she never abstracts these characters from their diurnal activities or vocations or from their environment in order to express these basic traits of their characters. Thus, the Middlemarch society which she depicts with its various professionals, squire, auctioneer, banker, doctor, scholar, represents the complex web of relationships and represents, as it were, the microcosm of man in the world. What is to be taken note of is the fact the imagery of the web runs as a leitmotif through the entire novel, showing the interconnectedness not only of the plots but pointing at perhaps the Darwinian evolutionary theories which were much in the air. Hence, the major characters and even the minor ones are shown as busy men whose work is important not only for them but also intended to serve society at large. Ultimately, vocation is not referred to as something in the passing or just offhand, as it used to be done since the time of Chaucer in his Canterbury Tales. Now, if you remember the Canterbury Tales, you would remember that it brings together several characters from several spheres of life and several vocations, but their work is not what is discussed during the course of the work. They are pilgrims who are on a holiday going on a pilgrimage to a distant place. And this is a trend which more or less continues almost till the novels of Jane Austen. It is Eliot's Middlemarch which revolutionized the entire idea of vocation in a realistic fashion. In fact, so concerned was Eliot in her protests especially against women's constricted lives and their need to extend their being into productive action, that she shrewdly seems to have tried to appeal to the good sense of men through letters and through her novels. Because Eliot felt that debased women actually debase men in the long run, and that ill-educated women destroy ambitious men, just like Rossum and Vincey in Middlemarch eventually does destroy the potential of Tercius Lydgate the doctor. And she had this foresight to understand, like many of the feminists of her time, that women's lot is dependent on the lot of men, and if their lot had to be changed, then the good sense of men had to be aroused. Now, coming to the characters of the novel, especially the heroine Dorothy Brooke, from the very inception of the novel, she emerges as an altruistic, philanthropic woman, and Eliot parallels her with Saint Teresa of Avila in the Prelude. Saint Teresa's ideal nature demanded an epic life or heroic activity in life, which her circumstances in medieval times made it possible for her to attain, to become a saint figure. But not so for the Victorian woman Dorothy Brooke. Here it is pertinent to digress and refer to the words of another important female character in Eliot's canon, who is Esther in Felix Holt the Radical, another novel where vocation is a central theme, where she utters these very pertinent words, and I quote, "A woman is dependent on what happens to her. She must take meaner things because only meaner things are within her reach." A very telling comment which can be applicable to Dorothy in Middlemarch, who too wants to passionately build cottages for the tenants of Middlemarch, and she is either discouraged or underestimated, and she cannot help feeling regretful when she finds there is nothing else that she can do for them. "I have known so few ways of making my life good for anything. I must learn new ways of helping people." That is all that she can think and say. And it is interesting to mention that it is in the desire to do something good for the rest of humanity that she takes a very wrong decision in marrying a man like Edward Casaubon, a discussion that I will come to in a few moments. Thus, Eliot shows the narrow limits within which women can operate and the still limited sphere of selecting a vocation. Thus, when Dorothy is introduced to Dr. Tercius Lydgate, who has both the opportunity and the clear plan about medical reform, she goes out of her way to assist him financially and also is able to support him emotionally, almost as a kindred soul searching for an anchorage in the vocation of philanthropy. Dorothy is a young woman with intense emotional and spiritual yearnings, whose outlet appears to be of primary concern to the movement of the narrative. Marriage is portrayed as a vocation for her, just as it were for most Victorian women, and she erroneously considers the ideal marriage to be one where romantic love and vocational aspiration are in harmony. It was still the purpose in educating women to keep them in their role as the domestic, middle-class wife and mother. John Ruskin, a noted writer of the Victorian period, believed that a woman's education should be such that it take into consideration a husband's need to share his interest with his wife and conduct intelligent conversation with her. Nothing more was required of her education actually. Thus, Dorothy's prime ingredient in looking for a partner is to prove useful to his goal of life and find self-fulfillment through his achievements. Often, however, these two are at cross purposes and in conflict, such as in Dorothy's marriage to Edward Casaubon. When she soon discovers that her husband's needs are absolutely different from her own, she had in fact married the man of her choice, and she had thought of Mr. Casaubon as having a mind so much above her own that he must often be claimed by studies which she could not entirely share or even understand. Coming to the other important central character of the novel, Tercius Lydgate, who is a doctor who wishes to implement revolutionary changes in medical treatment by opening up a new fever hospital which will research into unknown fevers which appeared as potential threats for the Victorian population. And he is carefully delineated by Eliot. We are given a fish-eye view of Dr. Lydgate in his vocation, and Eliot's own superior knowledge of science and medicine renders the character dimensions of credibility. And it's interesting to note here that Eliot, because of her learnedness and because of her ability to write in detail about these medical practices and research, had often been criticized. Lydgate's innovations and reforms are looked upon with suspicion by the other doctors and the populace of Middlemarch in general, and puts him into trouble, and eventually the prejudice against him in profession is carried over to his personal life, where eventually Middlemarch society implicates him of foul play in the Raffles affair related to Bulstrode. Lydgate's noble and ambitious plans are also sacrificed at the altar of marriage with a wrong woman, Rosamund Vincey. He is married to Rosamund, who is extremely beautiful but extremely insensitive, and she exercises the invisible bonds of marriage to trammel the paths of Lydgate's life and his work, which is in turn his life. And its repercussions are felt in his professional life, and it's interesting how at the crux of the novel lies this point about being unable to differentiate a person from his chosen vocation, and how sometimes vocation actually reveals the essence of an individual. That is a point that Eliot beautifully puts across to us through these very poignant lines which she puts in the mouth of Lydgate, where he says, "And to say that you love me without loving the medical man in me is the same sort of thing as to say that you like eating a peach but you don't like its flavor." So something which is inextricable. Lydgate ultimately fails in pursuing his grand schemes and abandons both practice and Middlemarch to carry on a compromising but very lucrative practice in London. Lydgate's marriage to Rosamund precipitates his downfall and is also abundant in conflict, part of this stemming from Rosamond's inability to understand why Lydgate, who's clever for doing anything and everything, would have to take up such a practice which brings them no social prestige or monetary benefit. The narrator here appears to be favouring Lydgate in his instance, as it attaches much value to a professional vocation that is both intellectually fulfilling and socially useful. Lydgate is also shown to be very noble in accepting his responsibility for the happiness that Rosamond has vested in him. All marriages in the novel are not marked by such conflict and self-effacement for either partner, such as those of the Garths. Caleb Garth and his wife show a union which is held up as a kind of ideal and serves as a powerful contrast to the story's failed marriages, such as an awareness of the others, with the narrator clearly articulating the characteristics which made a marriage successful. Clearly articulating the characteristics which make it successful, such as the awareness of the other partner's needs and understanding of their aspirations, qualities which are absent from the failed marriages referred to in the novel of Casaubon and Dorothy, Lydgate and Rosamond. Edward Casaubon is another character into whose vocation, if at all his redundant research called the key to all mythologies can be considered as vocation at all, we get a close insight. Casaubon is sarcastically referred to as a Loic Cicero, whose aim of life is to find out a simple link which binds all cultures and all nations. And it's interesting to note that unidimensional character, the flatness of Casaubon's character, even in his choice of vocation, he has a single perspective towards life. He has the quest for a single key to all mythologies. He does not understand that the world, the universe around him is built on multiplicity, on diversity. And that is why his vocation is doomed right from the beginning. His inability to probe into diversities renders his research as defunct as his personality. And he has dedicated 47 years of his life to this dead weight of his research, and this is the past that he brings to the relationship with the young Dorothy. Yet, even long before Will Ladislaw rather recklessly destroys Dorothy's illusions about the usefulness of Casaubon's voluminous project, he perhaps himself realized the futility of his pursuit, and it is probably this sense of failure in Casaubon which embitters his marital relationship with Dorothy, because he starts clubbing Dorothy with the shallow world around him, who are constantly probing at him and proving his inability to complete his work. And it is out of spite for her excellence and superior sensibilities that he keeps the cruel codicil in his will, rather than mere jealousness at the probable relationship developing between Will and Dorothy. Apart from the central characters, there are others whose tryst with finding a vocation is a process of finding themselves. One such character is that of Will Ladislaw. He is introduced initially in the novel as a man with Shelleyan ideals. He is an aesthete, a bohemian character, somebody who is referred to as a dilettante. However, it is through his love for Dorothy that he transforms from an indecisive man to a purposeful man, and finally enters politics and plays the role for social reform. Another important character who displays this movement from uselessness to usefulness through a vocation is Fred Vincey, Rosamond Vincey's brother, who is a confirmed layabout who has no ambition beyond the desire to inherit money so that he can live a life of pleasure and never have to work. However, being a wealthy man of an aristocratic family, he is constantly egged on by his family to enter the church as a clergyman, because that was considered to be the proper thing to do for men of wealthy families at that time, irrespective of whether they feel the spiritual calling or not for such a vocation. It is only with the help of clergyman Fairbrother that he is saved from destroying his life by entering a wrong vocation and finding his happiness in a life of work under Caleb Garth and finally settling down with his daughter Mary Garth. What is important is that in these, Eliot seems to hint to his readers to recognize how the choice of a vocation one loves was necessary for the overall happiness in human life. Also, through the character of Nicholas Bulstrode, she also tries to hint at the fact that the harmfulness of choosing a profession based on immoral means is enough to give you momentary power and prestige in society, but eventually leads to your downfall and is again poignantly the truth about a society where women especially, no matter how talented or how rare they were, had little opportunity to stand alone in their excellence. The narrator sarcastically comments in the finale, "Many who knew her," meaning Dorothy, "thought it a pity that so substantive and rare a creature should have been absorbed into the life of another and be known in a certain circle as a wife and mother, but no one stated exactly what else that was in her power she ought rather to have done." This is an excellent insight into the social position of the Victorian woman indeed. Yet one may argue that in a happy and balanced marriage, where partners are placed on an equal footing, that Dorothy finds her true calling and vocation. Because under Dorothy's sway, Will Ladislaw, who has been discussed already as a casual and amorous aesthete, becomes politically and humanely more serious. He is able to find first work as a reporter when he comes back to work for the newspaper run by Dorothy's uncle Arthur Brooke, and later finally towards the end where he enters politics and becomes involved in the reform that is the backdrop of the novel. Meanwhile, Dorothy, hitherto a self-denying moralist, in her marriage with Ladislaw becomes more aware of her own desires, more amorous, and eventually finds a more self-fulfilling life. Each reforms the other as they reform themselves, and marriage thus becomes a serious vocation for both partners and a basis for social reform. Together they embody mutual respect, steady love, and lasting intimacy. Together they model the transformative possibilities of sympathetic understanding. Readers who thus understand their marriage will not regret that so substantive a creature such as Dorothy was absorbed into Will's life only as a wife and mother. This doesn't mean that Dorothy has wasted her life. This is for the first time that sense of fulfillment has come into Dorothy's life, because she is able to manage to be both a wife and a mother and also be useful to society in an indirect manner, rather than the Dorothy that we are acquainted with right at the beginning of the novel. This is a different Dorothy. However, apart from being the all-pervasive role which marriage played in the lives of Victorian women, Middlemarch highlights the need for every individual, be it man or woman, to have a vocation or goal in life. That is the central significance of the novel. In Middlemarch, Eliot bridges this hiatus between man in life who is engaged in vocation and man in fiction who spends an almost disproportionate time on love or other irrelevant issues. English fiction attains an almost never before level of maturity in the hands of Eliot, who even treats marriage as a vocation, and in future lectures we might be able to take up the fact that the education of a person's sympathy, the ability to extend, to grow one's sympathy, to understand one's neighbor not as oneself but rather as themselves, is the purpose of Eliot's novel. And this is why vocation is one of the central themes of the novel. Thank you.